Good morning, New York Giants fans, and welcome to our Giants Saints debacle postmortem. Ed Valentine of Big Blue View here with Tony DelGenio to review, as we always do, the day after games. Tony, good morning to you. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great. Hey, listen, should we just keep this to the first two drives?
Yeah, that would be nice.
Should we just talk about the first two drives? They,
Petition
nothing
the
else of nothing else of importance happened.
Yep. Yeah, petition the NFL to make games 20 minutes long.
Hey, if you're going to go and lose a football game to the worst team on your schedule, to a winless team, you might as well do it in absolutely spectacular, somewhat historic fashion. And to the Giants' credit, that's exactly what they did on Sunday. I think, 5 straight possessions with turnovers, tying a record that I think the last team to do that was it the Jets 9 years ago, according to the broadcast. Just amazing in all the penalties and all the other mistakes, and just amazing that the Giants played that badly.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's an indictment on the coaching, and
Absolutely.
maybe it's an indictment on the GM as well. And
Absolutely.
it's hard to look at a game like that and say this is a well-coached team.
Absolutely. It's I have to make an admission here. I went to practice on Thursday, and we're sitting in the media room, and it was amazingly there were only about 4 people in there, which tells you that even the media is giving up on the Giants at this point. Maybe there was a half a dozen people in there, which is about half the usual crowd. And even after a win, we were just talking about the Giants, and I said, I said to somebody in the room, I said, the Giants have been so bad for so long now that they're not even coming up with new ways to be bad. They're just recycling old ways to be bad. And with kicker issues and all that kind of stuff. And Sunday, to their credit, they came up with a new way to be bad. So just amazing.
That makes it interesting.
But I take some blame for that because I was looking for something new from the Giants. Hopefully, I was actually, look, something new might have been good football that led to a winning streak, but we got something new in a bad, sort of typical of the last 15 years New York Giants way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and go ahead. I mean,
no, go ahead, Tony.
I have no response to that other than to shake my head up and down.
let's get into. I mean, let's get into something specific. I am not going to blame Jackson Dart. Okay, look, I said a week ago, don't put the kid in the Hall of Fame. After one game where statistically he wasn't great, but he put him a bust. To Dart's credit, last night, he took the blame for the loss. He said it was on him, and let's be real, it wasn't on him. Yes, he threw 2 interceptions. Yes, he fumbled a ball, but this is a rookie quarterback making his second NFL start. This is making his first start on the road. This is a kid. You have to help this kid. You have to help this kid. You have to make the plays that are there to be made. You can't can't have 8 penalties that continually give the opposition opportunities. You can't continue to drop passes. You can't fumble the football. You can't stop on your pass routes that lead to interceptions. You can't drop wide open passes. You have to make some plays to help the kid. And the Giants, after those first 2 drives, did nothing to help Dart at all. So yes, he made the fumble, which, put the ball away for God's sakes, but he'll learn from that. He threw 2 interceptions, neither of which I'm going to blame him for. He did learn to slide. He did do that. So that's a positive,
Yeah.
but I don't know about you. I can't blame Jackson Dart. It's just the ups and downs of what you're going to get with a rookie quarterback, learning the ropes in the NFL.
Yeah, I'm not too upset at Dart. I mean, as you know, the fumble was a ridiculous play, and as you say, you got to learn to put the ball away. As soon as you decide you're gonna run. But I don't think the blame mainly goes on him, even though he did not have a particularly good day after the first quarter. I think the blame lies. I think a lot of the blame lies with the defense, and I mean the combination of the personnel and how they're being coached, and the overlap between those two things is who actually is on the 53 and active for a game in a given week. And to me, that's as much of a head scratcher as anything. But I think that they're getting uninspired defensive coaching. I think they're getting uninspired offensive coaching too, because the Giants offense to me always just looks like a scramble around, try to find something thing, rather than an organized attempt to exploit mismatches and things like that. And so the team always looks like it's just kind of chaotic, whether it's on offense or defense. And I think we have to question, who's made active and who's not made active in any given week, because we've had that question now for several weeks, and how they leave themselves open to criticism when guys go down with injuries because they don't actually have an adequate backup active that day. And just the whole thing is looking to me like an organization that's spiraling downward at this point. And it's amazing to say that just 1 week after a really uplifting victory, but that's the way it looks. And when you look that way against a bad team, which the Saints are, then you really have to question things.
Well, it's one of those things, Tony. It's like watching the 450-yard Russell Wilson game in week 2 that they lost. It quickly became apparent that what we saw in week 2 with Russ was an aberration. I think he had one of those types of games last year in Pittsburgh. He had 1 or 2 the year before with Denver. It was an aberration. It's just not something he can do consistently. And you look at week 4, and you have to consider it an aberration with what we saw before it in the 3 weeks before it, and what we saw on Sunday. You have to consider playing a mostly clean game and making a few winning plays at the end. You have to consider it an aberration. That's the only way you can look at it. In terms of, let's stay with the offense for now. You used the word chaotic, and I thought, and I'll be honest with you, I thought Mike Kafka, offensive coordinator, had a good day calling plays on Sunday. I thought the plan to use Daniel Bellinger was good. I thought the red zone play calling was good. They got 2 touchdown passes early to Theo Johnson. I thought there was some movement. There was some misdirection in the offense. There were efforts to do things, even using Wan'Dale Robinson as a running back, as a runner on the 4th and 1 play, I thought was good. It was creative. They tried to use the wide receiver screens. I thought they tried things. The flea flicker play, was perfectly timed in terms of when they called it, and should have been a touchdown. I thought by the 4th quarter, it's desperation time, and you're in that throw the ball down the field, try for chunk plays where it looks chaotic because it is chaotic. But I thought Kafka was fine. I just think that what it leads to, Tony, is that we have to talk about the wide receiver position. And I think we all knew the Giants would miss Malik Neighbors. And I didn't think about Neighbors a whole lot during the game yesterday, but when you revisit the game and when you look at the way it unfolded, the Giants tried to cover for not having Neighbors by going heavily to Theo Johnson and Daniel Bellinger. Darius Slayton had a terrible day, and then came up with a hamstring injury. Jalen Hyatt proved once again why the Giants really don't trust him to put him on the field. Bo Collins showed the same thing he showed in the preseason, that maybe he has physical talent, but he had 2 instances in the preseason where I believe he ran the wrong route and cost a quarterback an interception. Yesterday, he stops his route and costs Jackson Dart an interception because Dart thought he was going to come across the field. And I hate to say it, when I watch Bo Collins, I think about Reuben Randall, who was an interception waiting to happen every time Eli Manning threw him the ball. And now without Neighbors, probably without Slayton on Thursday night against the Eagles. Slayton, who's a good player who had a bad day. All right, good player who had a bad day. I don't know what the Giants do at wide receiver. One of those personnel things you talked about was little Jordan Humphrey not being brought to the active roster on Sunday. And I know I'm going on and on here a little bit, Tony, but I'm shaking my head about that one because the only reason for that not to have happened, little Jordan Humphrey should have been signed to the 53-man roster for Sunday. All right. The Giants went into the game and they had the same number of players dressed as the Saints had for the game. They had 46 players active for the game. So that's not an issue. They weren't playing 46 against 44 or 48 against 46. But they had 2 open roster spots. Okay. They didn't sign little Jordan Humphrey to the active roster, and they didn't fill the 53rd spot, in my view, largely because they have $1.6 million left on the salary cap to get them through the rest of the season. And not signing little Jordan Humphrey to the active roster saved them a few pennies of that $1.6 million. So that's cap mismanagement by Joe Shane. That is draining your resources to the point where you don't have enough money to get through the year. And that's just, I shake my head because Joe seems to do that every year. But back to the wide receiver point, Tony, I don't know what they do at this point.
Yeah. So my thoughts on that. Well, first of all, I see a comment there. Duchesne in the front office make them keep Hyatt on the team. I'm actually interested to see what we learned today about the game yesterday, because on TV, whenever I was looking and they were trying to throw the ball to Hyatt, he wasn't open, and he's a receiver that absolutely cannot fight a defensive back to make a contested catch. And so the only way that Hyatt can be a useful player on this team is if he gets open. And again,
Tony, I just want to interrupt you for a second to back up that point. Next gen stats. lists all the advanced stats for receivers and everything. They had Hyatt at less than a yard of separation on all of his pass routes on Sunday, which is just terrible. So anyway,
Okay,
continue. I just wanted to back up that point.
I'm interested to hear that because I had made a comment about Hyatt in my write up right after the game yesterday, and one of the BBV commenters said that Carl Banks was saying online during the game that Hyatt was open several times downfield and Dart wouldn't throw him the ball. So I was curious to find out, today, now that people have a chance to watch the All 22, is he getting open downfield and Dart's not throwing to him, or is he just not getting open? And at this point, if he's not getting open, I'm not sure what the rationale is for keeping him on the team. But then coming back to your point about little Jordan Humphrey, and the thing is about little Jordan Humphrey is that he is and he's not going to be a world beater, right? I mean, there's a reason that the Giants were able to pick him up in the first place. It's not like he's going to be Keenan Allen or something like that.
No.
Right, but he's a guy who is a veteran who has actually been somewhat productive in a different offense, and who showed a little something, during training camp, and he's got some size, and that's another thing, is that this team seems to be allergic to X type wide receivers, and they seem to always fall in love with the the fast guys that they think can make explosive plays. But I thought, gee, yesterday it would have been nice to have little Jordan Humphrey out there as another option to throw the ball to, because as you say, they're already compromised because of Neighbor's injury, and that goes back to the question of also how Joe Shane handled the finances. And I keep on coming back to the fact that the Giants are one of only two teams in the NFL that have $0 in void year costs. And void year costs, although I don't think you want to go all Howie Roseman and get hundreds of millions of dollars in void year costs. Most NFL teams kind of have tens of millions of dollars in void year costs, and it's a way to get more talent on your team now without getting yourself into too much of a financial hole, because there are always creative ways to deal with that down the road. And the Giants refuse to do that. And so you mentioned Joe Shane, mismanaging the finances and having $1.6 million left in the middle of the season to do things. And that's why he's elevating Bo Collins. But it's like, if you're handling the finances in a way that you're forcing your team to make personnel decisions that maybe aren't the best personnel decisions for you, then you've got to, I think, rethink how you do things. And so that's a big question I have about the Giants going forward, is that are they even taking an approach with the construction of the roster that is optimal for getting you wins and for accommodating things that you can't foresee. And so there's always an injury, and yesterday it was Slayton. Right. And so you wish they had another experienced receiver out there. It could have been one of the running backs, in which case they only had two running backs active for the day. And if one of them had gotten hurt, then they would have been in trouble at running back, and it goes on and on and on, that you wonder whether they are actually doing the best job possible to set up the team that they actually have to win.
It's an interesting point, Tony, and that the problem is you only get 46 or 48 guys active on a given week. And, you always have to make compromises. You have to make a decision here and there. And there's always somewhere on the roster where you're gambling. But it seems like with the Giants, it seems like whatever gamble they take always comes back to bite them. And Lil Jordan Humphrey's not an all-pro wide receiver. He's not a Pro Bowler. I think he had a career-high 30-some-odd catches last year.
Mm-hmm.
He's a guy with a very specific skill set, but he's a guy that's caught passes in the NFL. He's a guy that should know where to be, and which Bo Collins doesn't seem to know where to be. And he's a guy that on a 50-50 ball, he can go up and get it. All right, which Jalen Hyatt can't do. It's clear. I don't know how much weight Jalen Hyatt gained this offseason. He said he gained 20 to 25 pounds. And I don't know. I've been around. I like Jalen a lot. I've kidded around with Jalen for years now about the silly little bit of hair he's trying to grow up on his top lip. And, and he and I have had a lot of conversations over the years. But I need to see Jalen Hyatt stand on the scale to believe that he's more than 180 or 185 pounds, to be honest with you. So I just don't know. But it's clear, when you're going into week 5, Tony, a few years ago, the Giants with one of the Dave Gettleman years, the Giants were really, really close to the cap, and they were bad. They were bad. And I don't remember what year it was, but they went the last 3 or 4 weeks of the season with 2 open roster spots. And they did that because they were 4-13 or whatever they were. They were going to win 3 or 4 games. And they had to save a couple nickels to stay under the salary cap. And signing 2 more guys to the active roster wasn't going to make any difference. But this is week 5. This was week 5. This was coming off the most inspiring win you've had in at least 2 years. And not to be able to manage the salary cap in a way where you could fill out your roster, I thought was just awful. And when Slayton got hurt, it came back to bite him. And it bothered me quite a bit. But when you think about wide receiver, all right, let's assume, and we haven't talked to Brian Daboll yet, let's assume Slayton is going to miss Thursday's game against the Eagles. I think however they figure it out cap-wise, I think they have to bring at least little Jordan Humphrey off the practice squad and sign him to the roster. And again, he's not going to solve every problem, but they need the help. But what else can they do? They had held a wide receiver workout on Friday, and I just saw that one of the guys they worked out signed to the Denver Broncos active roster. And to be honest, if I had a choice between signing with the Giants active roster and the Broncos active roster, I'd choose the Broncos too. All right. But because if for no other reason, then I'm getting a playoff check. All right. I'm getting a playoff check. And I'm gonna play on a team that wins some football games the rest of the year. So, but I don't know what they do. Do they sign Gabe Davis off the Bills practice squad? I know Isaiah Hodgins is on somebody's practice squad. I don't know if it's the 49ers or whatever, but do they go sign Isaiah Hodgins? Hodgins is a guy that got buried with the Giants, but he knows how to run routes. He knows where to be. He can catch the football. He knows this offense. Gabe Davis knows this offense. They need help now. They don't need to bring somebody in that can help them 3 weeks from now. They need help on Thursday night. So I don't know what they do. I don't know if you have any ideas on what they can do personnel wise.
Yeah, and so I think the die is cast now, right? And what I think they did not do is to do well in drafting. I saw one of the questions. I lost track of where it is in the list, but one of the questions about how much of this is poor drafting, and I think what you're seeing now is that the 2023 draft, it has just turned out to be such a disaster for them because you have
but Tay Banks is a great kickoff returner.
He is a nice kickoff returner, right? I mean, you have Tay Banks who is I mean he just seems to have regressed since the first half of his rookie year. I mean, it's strange for me to see a player who not only doesn't improve but actually seems to get worse as time goes on. And he certainly looks like that. And I think somebody commented in the BB View comments yesterday, or or on X. I'm not sure where, but if they said if Tay Banks is so bad, why do they put him on the field on third down, the most important passing down out there? If you think he's so bad in coverage, and that's a good question. That's a nice question for Shane Bowen and his group is why are you putting him out there on third down? And Jalen Hyatt, is just. I mean, I don't blame them for drafting Hyatt, and he was drafted in the third round, not in the first round, but still, the fact is that coming into the 2025 season, could you have found someone to draft in round 5 or round 6 or something like that who might have just given you a little something? And wide receivers, there are a lot of wide receivers who come out of college and perform fairly well in the NFL. They just don't seem to have that type of group. And again, I come back to that they don't want to spend the money on free agents that would force them to use void years. And so they go into the season with a group that once somebody gets injured at the top becomes very thin. And then when your top two guys, your wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 get injured, then they've just got very little beyond that. And, Wan'Dale Robinson is a nice receiver, but, that he was not worth the second round pick that they used on him. And so I think, I think we're seeing that some of the draft picks that we questioned at the time are not working out, and some of the ones that we thought were good at the time are not working out, and a little bit of that is luck, but this is the problem. I think they're not hitting on enough of the draft picks, and we haven't even gotten over to the defense yet. We can talk about that too, but on offense, they just haven't hit on enough of the draft picks to make you feel confident in their ability to do it going forward. And that's an indictment of the entire front office, not just Joe Shane.
Absolutely. I want to hit a couple thoughts on some of the things that you said, Tony. Tay Banks, the Giants have been putting him in the game on third down, and I don't know if he played more than a couple of snaps on Sunday after
Eight.
He played 8, but I was going to say he only played a couple after the penalty. Okay. He only played a couple after the penalty. I think there were a couple snaps where I think it was either Cordell Flott or Drew Phillips had gotten nicked up and had to come off. So they put Banks back in the game. But this is one of those things that I hate. I hate. And look, I don't know that this is Joe Shane, but teams go to extreme measures. Look at what Jerry Reese did with Eric Flowers. Ben McAdoo wanted to move Eric Flowers from left tackle to right tackle almost from the second that Ben became Giants head coach. Jerry wouldn't allow it because Jerry drafted Eric Flowers to be a left tackle, and he was bound and determined that he was going to be proven right, that Eric Flowers was a left tackle. And that decision cost the Giants for 2 or 3 years. So GMs, front offices, head coaches, they do stuff like this all the time. They will go to extraordinary lengths to prove that they weren't wrong. Okay. The one thing that Tay Banks does well, or theoretically does well defensively, is play man-to-man defense. So what the Giants have done is they stick him out there on third down when they are almost certainly going to be in some sort of man coverage alignment. And they're doing it. I'm sorry. Cordell Flott at this point is a better player. The Giants are doing it, in my view, simply to justify or try to justify where they drafted Tay Banks. And that's not a reason to put a guy on the field. But I mean, we can talk about Evan Neal too. We can talk about Hyatt. We can talk about all of that. In terms of void years, I think the plan has been with Joe Shane that he doesn't want to start pushing money into the future until he thinks that the Giants are actually in a position, which they are now, with the rookie quarterback on on an inexpensive contract, where they have some money, where they should theoretically have some flexibility and have a young quarterback that they want to build around. If Joe gets to keep his job, I would expect his void year stance to change. The problem is his void year stance over the last 2 or 3 years might be part of the reason he ends up losing his job. And the only other thing I'm going to say is, when the Giants drafted Wan'Dale Robinson, George Pickens was available. All right. George Pickens was available, and George Pickens is a diva, and George Pickens is a pain in the neck. And George Pickens isn't the greatest locker room guy in the world, from what I understand. But George Pickens is one heck of a difference-making football player. And why you pick a 5'8", 185-pound receiver with the shortest arms in the league over a guy like Pickens, I don't know. But the Giants did. So it is
But I
what
think
it
you,
is.
I think you mentioned there probably exactly the reason why they didn't take George Pickens. It was all of the off the field stuff, and off the field, including just on the sidelines. I mean, not but yeah, George Pickens came out of school with a bad reputation, right? And we know from things that Joe Shane has said that their draft board only contains something like 150 guys. It doesn't contain 250 guys. That they only consider about 150 guys at most draftable, and there are various reasons, right? We saw during the Hard Knocks thing, they have the color coding things, right? That they have up there, and there are guys that I think who are talented, that they just rule out for reasons other than what they can do once they step on the field. And you really have to imagine, because it was such an obvious thing, right, at that point, that if you were going to take a wide receiver at that point in the second round, George Pickens is screaming out there to be taken at that point in the draft, and you're passing him over, as you say, for, and again, no knock on Wan'Dale Robinson, but he's not a game-changing player. And
No.
George Pickens can be a game-changing player, and you're seeing that with Dallas, right? I mean, as well as with Pittsburgh, he was right. It's just that he's a pain in the neck to deal with, and they didn't want. I think they make very clear that their philosophy is, don't put guys on this team who are going to be a pain in the neck to deal with. And so at some point that starts biting, jumping up and biting you, and I think that's one of those examples.
Yeah, there's so much to get to here, Tony, and I want to just mention to the folks that are commenting and asking questions. It's a really busy comment section today. I don't know how many of your questions we're going to be able to get to. Hopefully, as Tony and I are sort of rambling along here, we hit most of the topics that you guys are interested in. It's kind of tough to follow because the comments are flying pretty quickly. Before we talk about defense, Tony, let's talk about coaching. All right. And there are some things in the comments about Brian Daboll and about, all of the penalties and all of the fumbles and interceptions and all of that. And look, in one game, in my view, you don't necessarily blame Brian Daboll for Jackson Dart dropping the ball when he started to scramble. But we saw this all of last year. Penalties, mistakes, missed assignments, turnovers. When it happens consistently, week in and week out, when playing clean football is the exception rather than the rule, when you're an undisciplined football team that commits way too many penalties in the secondary, way too many pre-snap penalties, when you turn the ball over, when you drop the ball too often, which is more often than not a lack of concentration, or sometimes a lack of not being exactly where you're supposed to be. It is absolutely a reflection on the coaching staff, because the coaching staff's job is to fix those issues. The coaching staff's job is to get players to pay attention to detail, to know situations, to do their jobs correctly, to pay attention to the small things. And when it happens consistently, and go back to 2023, and I think you probably look at the 2025 Giants and you're looking at the same at largely the same issues. Penalties, lack of assignment soundness, mistakes all the time, inability to make plays when it counts. All of that comes back to coaching. All of that lands on Brian Daboll's desk. And listen, I have said many times that I think the Giants are looking for reasons to keep Brian Daboll, looking for reasons to keep him with Jackson Dart. But the more games that you see like this, when the good game is an aberration and the mistake-ridden failures are the rule, it's harder and harder to justify not making a change at some point.
Yeah, and it wouldn't surprise me if that change is made before the end of the season. And I think the biggest, I think at this point, unless there's a dramatic turn, and we all knew that the Giants had a very difficult schedule, especially up front. The first half of the season, they're just loaded with good teams, and so I don't think any of us expected them to win many games. And I have to admit, I didn't expect that they'd win the Chargers game and lose the Saints game, but that's the Giants way. All right, and with the Eagles coming up twice in the next 3 weeks, and then sandwiched in between Denver, who just beat the Eagles, you really have to indict the coaching. And the other thing, I mean, I think it happens a couple of times, and you dismiss it. But I saw a comment very early in the pod today about how many guys leave the Giants and then go on to succeed elsewhere, and and obviously Daniel Jones is Exhibit A in that, and it's kind of embarrassing how well he's playing for Indianapolis when outside of his first year under Dable, he didn't play well with the Giants. But you're seeing this with other guys around the league who play, if anything, better when they leave the Giants than with them. And at some point, as an ex-scientist, at some point the number of data points that seem to support the idea that the coaching is poor, well, there are a lot of data points now about players leaving the Giants and playing better with their next team. And so I really feel like Dable is gone, and the only question is whether it happens sooner rather than later. And I think you can't wait until the bye week, because their bye week is very late this year. If they had a bye week coming up in 2 or 3 weeks, I wouldn't be surprised if they would have made the move then. But gee, I mean, if they get embarrassed these next 3 weeks against good opponents and come out not only being 1-7, but 1-7 and looking awful, then I think after that second Eagles game, I got to think that they make the move to get rid of Dable and maybe install Kafka as the head coach for the rest of the season. I don't know whether Kafka has what it takes to be a good head coach, but the guy's been trying to get a position for several years now, and maybe you give him a shot and see whether he can change anything. I just feel like there's very little evidence at the moment that the Giants are a well-coached team, and I find myself being amazed to say that after the 2022 season, when I marveled over how well coached they seem to be because of the number of games they were able to win with a roster that had almost no talent.
Absolutely. Tony, I have a question for you. Who scored the game-winning touchdown yesterday for the Denver Broncos?
Oh, is that? Oh no, that wasn't the Scatabo fumble. That was
No,
returned for.
for the Broncos.
For the Broncos. I don't know. I didn't see that game.
Evan Bleepin Ingram.
Oh, Evan, right,
Evan
Evan Engram.
Evan
The
Ingram.
Yeah.
Evan Ingram. Just another guy out there that we don't talk about very much, that several Giants coaching staffs couldn't seem to get the most out
Yep.
of. But I'll do you one better when it comes to Brian Daboll. The Giants play Thursday night. If they lose 40-0, they have a week and a half before they play the Denver Broncos. If they lose 40-0 to the Eagles on Thursday night, if they embarrass themselves on national television again, which they did a number of times the last couple of years, I think a case can be made that if for no other reason than to save some face here, than to avoid having planes flying over MetLife Stadium for the rest of the season demanding change and all of that. If they get embarrassed on Thursday night, I think you can make a case that they have an interim head coach against the Denver Broncos.
I could definitely see that happening, and I mean at two levels. I could see them making a change then if they get embarrassed, and I could easily see them getting embarrassed on Thursday night because the Eagles are going to be ticked off after losing that game to Denver, because I think they are not a happy group right now, because despite the fact that they'd been 4-0 coming into that game, they're not playing well this season either.
No.
And they're scrambling to win every game that they play lately. They only won the week before because of a blocked kick on the last play of the game, and so they've looked very vulnerable. There are apparently grumbles on the team that they're not using the wide receivers enough and stuff like that. Saquon Barkley is not having the dominant season this year that he had the season before, and so they've got their own kind of issues to deal with this week, and you can just imagine them coming into that game with the Giants in a bad mood, saying, "Hey, we got to do it this week," and rolling up the score. And you know that the Eagles are the type of team that wouldn't mind rolling the score on the Giants on national TV.
Right. It's just the last thing I'll say about Brian Daboll is, look, I like Daboll. All right, as a person, I like Daboll. I think he's a good guy. But in the 2022 season, was pretty magical for Daboll and the Giants. And I supported bringing Daboll and Shane back this year. All right. But the thing of it is, now we have 2.5 years worth of evidence at this point. 2.5 years worth of evidence that Brian Daboll doesn't have the answers to the things that plague the Giants on a week in and week out basis. And I do wonder if Giants players have begun to check out on him a little bit. I really do. I do wonder if players have begun to check out and not listen to Daboll. And once that happens, you don't get the room back. So I don't know. I don't know how Brian Daboll fixes this, because he hasn't been able to fix it for 2.5 years. So, I mean, if he had the answers, if he had ways to change the situation and change the mistakes and change the turnovers and change the lack of discipline if he was capable of fixing that, I think he would have fixed it by now. So that's my last thing that I will say about Daboll. Tony, you mentioned the defense a little bit, and let's just finish up with a couple of thoughts on the defense. Look, on the positive side, the Giants finally defended the run halfway decently on Sunday. I think they gave up less than 3 yards a carry. But look, when the New York Giants don't get to the quarterback, and they put pressure on Spencer Rattler on Sunday, but they never got there. They never actually. I'm not even sure they got any real hits on Rattler, but they pressured him, but they never got there. And when they don't get there, they get exposed. Their secondary is just not that good. Tyler Nubin, who's another guy who I like. I've had lots of good conversations with Nubin. I think his priorities are good. He's a pro. He wants to be good. He works at his craft. But Tyler Nubin is a guy who just athletically doesn't measure up to the standards of a lot of the guys that he's playing against. And that got badly exposed on that 87-yard touchdown pass. Tyler Nubin took one step too much inside and didn't have the athleticism to make up for that against a really fast wide receiver. He had no chance to make up for that. And that lack of athleticism is an issue. And Drew Phillips, I think, is a good player who's going through a rough stretch. He's committing too many penalties. He's getting picked on. Tay Banks is a good kick returner at this point. Javon Holland had a decent game yesterday, but Javon Holland hasn't given the Giants yet what they paid for. And I know that fans out there will say he's not giving the Giants what Xavier McKinney is giving the Green Bay Packers, and I can't argue with that. I will say there were reasons beyond his talent for Xavier McKinney moving on from the New York Giants. There were bridges burned by McKinney when he was still with the Giants. So, and the Giants were willing to pay Xavier McKinney the same contract that Javon Holland took, and Xavier McKinney said no and went and found more money. So the Giants did make an effort to keep McKinney, but the Packers went to the extreme to sign him, and that's what it is. But the secondary's not good, and when the pass rush doesn't get home, they get exposed, and that's really the bottom line. I don't know if you blame Shane Bowen if you want. I think the Giants only blitzed 4 times yesterday, and people will go ballistic about that. But the bottom line is if they don't hit the quarterback, they get exposed.
Yeah, and I think and blitzing a lot isn't really the answer, I think, to any defense's problems, because a good quarterback will know what to do against the blitz, and give Spencer Rattler some credit. He played a good game yesterday. Okay, and the other thing that he has is he has escapability. I mean, the Giants did get a rush, and part of the issue was that he was just able to escape the rush sometimes. And so he did not look bad at all. And in fact, Paulson Adebo apparently warned his Giants teammates that he thought Rattler was a good quarterback. But as you say, the Giants just they don't have that game changer in the secondary. And they going back to Tyler Nubin, I saw yesterday in one of the things that you posted after the game, you put up Tyler Nubin's RAS scores. And indeed, Tyler Nubin is a subpar athletically a defensive back. And yeah, you really saw that on that play. And the thing about Tyler Nubin is that, we're into his second year. and he still hasn't picked off a pass. And that was kind of his calling card at Minnesota. He was a ball hawk, and I thought, oh, the Giants really need a guy in that secondary who intercepts passes, right?
Mhm.
And he's done nothing for the Giants to do that. And I think basically you're seeing with Tyler Newman that if he's not playing in the box, he's not effective. I mean, he can be
Right.
effective in the slot if the slot
He's
receiver runs a short route, but if the slot receiver goes downfield the way Rashid did yesterday, he's
you
got
know,
no chance. He just cannot keep up with a speedy receiver out of the slot, and so for someone that they used second round capital on, I think he's just becoming a big disappointment.
at this point, I can't argue. He is a very aggressive tackler. He can be a really good run defender. Um, he can be really useful around the line of scrimmage, but he does get exposed out in the open field athletically. Um, like I said, if the Giants don't get home defensively, um, and there were two or three occasions, as you said, where Spencer Rattler was able to avoid the rush on Sunday. So anyway, Tony, just not a lot of positives, and I did want to address one comment here quickly that flashed by. Yeah, someone said, so we're blaming Daboll and we're not giving Joe Shane any blame, and I think that if you've listened to the entire show, I think you realize that that's not the case. There have been, the 2022 and 2023 drafts by Joe. And again, he's another guy that I like. I have a pretty good relationship with Joe at this point, but the 2022 and 2023 drafts are a black hole for the Giants for the most part. And some of the cap management is questionable. Um, some of the players that have gotten away from the Giants are questionable, although I I can give valid reasons for why each one of those moves was made. Um, but it's hard to watch these guys succeed elsewhere. So the point is, there's blame for the coaching staff. There's blame for the front office. Um, you don't you don't go. You're not as bad as the Giants have been, for the better part of 2.5 years, with the blame being assigned to only one person. There's blame. There's blame all the way around. Front office, coaches, players. There's blame for everybody.
Yeah, and I think specifically if that commenter goes back and watches the early part of the broadcast, we talked specifically about Banks and Hyatt being a disaster, and now we talked about Newman not working out either, and we talked about them Shane picking Wandale Robinson over George Pickett. So hopefully we have addressed the fact that there's a GM problem too. And by the way, but I'll just put a cherry on that and say that I honestly think that there's as almost as good a chance that Shane is gone at the end of the season as Dable. I just think Dable is in more immediate danger of being fired, but I could see them moving on completely from this group and going completely new next year, the way Washington did a year ago.
Yeah, I think there's a better chance that Shane stays than Dable stays, which is basically the same thing that you said. But again, the issue with that is then you've got a GM and a head coach on differing timelines, and and there's enough there's a there's enough evidence of of missed draft picks, of questionable decisions. There's enough evidence to justify moving on from Joe as well, if that's what ownership wants to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the evidence is right there in the division with Washington because Washington was in terrible shape a year plus ago, right? And I
Hmm.
mean, right? I mean, the Giants were still beating them almost every time they played them, and they had problems all over. And granted, they were fortunate enough that the new regime was fortunate enough that the previous regime was terrible enough that Washington had the #2 pick in the draft, and so they were able to take Jaden Daniels. But the improvement of Washington is a lot more than just Jaden Daniels. They brought in a lot of players, veterans who have helped them uh, uh, be winners, and they
Hmm.
have drafted young guys who are doing nice things for them. And so, I think you have to look at that and say, okay, those were two very different approaches to taking a bad team and building it into a good team. And the Giants took what I think was a more admirable approach to the problem of being financially conservative, not bringing in a ton of veterans and trying to build through the draft. The only problem is that only works if you draft well and if the few veterans that you do bring in play really well. And for Washington, it looks like they've drafted well, and it looks like they brought in veterans who play really well. And for the Giants, for the most part, it hasn't worked out that way. And so that's the gamble that you take when you try to take the approach that they're taking to building this team.
Absolutely, Tony. So I think that's probably a good place for us to call it a day. Appreciate the time as always. Giants fans, please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.